right where you're sitting now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Right Where You're Sitting Now. I'm your host, Joshua Lee, and you'll notice that the effervescent Ken Eakins is not sitting next to me. That's because his microphone pooped out on him right before the interview. Or so he says. I'm not really sure. We've been communicating through text only, and I can't really tell if he's lying, because I can't see his eyes. So we'll have to wait and see. This episode, though, we are talking to Julian Vayne. He's a psychonaut, an author, and a leading voice in the chaos magic tradition. I don't know if tradition's the right word for it. It's not especially old. Oh, maybe it is especially old now. For sure there's some listeners listening that are younger than... That's depressing. That makes me very old, too. Julian is the host of a YouTube show called My Magical Thing. It's really fun, worth a watch. He's also one of the head writers of the blog of Baphomet. In this episode, we talk about chaos magic a little bit, and we talk a lot about psychedelics and their place in a magical practice and their place in society as a whole. Ken, if you're out there listening, we missed you. We love you. We hope you come back safe and sound soon. Julian Vayne, everybody. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Today we've got Julian Vayne with us. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Good to see
you. For listeners who aren't familiar with your work, could you kind of fill them in and let them know why you're here?
Yeah, well, that's a big existential question to which I haven't got a good answer. But I'm Julian Vayne. I'm an occultist and I'm a writer. I've got a background in Wicca and kind of Neo-Paganism. I've got connections with Tantra and various other kind of magical disciplines, but I suppose people mostly know my work in the context of chaos magic. So I've written loads of stuff over the years. I'm involved quite a lot with the psychedelic community these days. So I'm involved with the organization Breaking Convention, which is a big psychedelics conference, happens every couple of years. And pandemic permitting will be happening in the University of Greenwich next year. So yeah, kind of that's me. Chaos magic, psychedelics, drugs, bit of sex. Fantastic.
A bit of sex. You do a lot of online classes, right? Especially now, I guess, right? Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I've been very fortunate over a number of years to be working with Treadwell's Books, which is this brilliant esoteric bookshop in London. And certainly since the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of kind of online courses with people, range of different stuff from kind of, cleansing, banishing and centering workshops for people who want to learn about those kind of areas through to, I think the most recent ones were one on Baphomet, one on chaos witchcraft, some Tantra stuff, which has gone down like really, really well. Obviously, you kind of limited a little bit with the format, but there's other things you can do in terms of engaging people. And the benefit of it is that you can have people rocking up to the class who I would not normally get to see with a physical workshop in Treadwell's. So we've had like people from Australia, Canada, the US, Jordan, various places in Europe. And it's been great. It's been really good. And then I do bits of kind of online mentoring for people, just kind of one-to-one stuff. And I'm just in the process of producing more kind of online courses, both my own material and also in collaboration with a couple of other organizations. So yeah, busy time.
Nice. It's nice to find the little corners that are blooming in the during the COVID. Strangely. So you're one of the big faces of chaos magic, and I get made fun of all the time for liking chaos magic. Can you explain to my friends why they're wrong?
Why they're wrong for thinking it's well, it depends what they think about it, I guess.
Well, I think usually what I get is like scoffs. I get scoffs and kind of, giggles about it, and jokes about wanting to evoke Spock.
Yeah, I mean, we have to look, I think, at the historical context for chaos magic. So chaos magic evolves in Europe primarily in the latter part of the 20th century. It's influenced by Discordianism. It's influenced by a kind of punk aesthetic, DIY culture. Why sit around waiting for a guru to turn up when we've all got access to lots of information, lots of techniques? Why not actually try something? Magic is a practice. It's experiential. So I think there's a great kind of emphasis on chaos magic with in terms of like doing stuff. If you're going to be engaged in this process of exploring, the self, spirituality, magic, whatever that means for you, then you've got to actually, really do the practice, do the work. Chaos magic, I think, sometimes unfairly gets imagined as being quite a kind of superficial approach to these things. And I have to say, from my experience, I know lots of chaos magicians who are able to move through different paradigms, different styles, different beliefs, but many of them have got, like me, kind of particular lineages or particular strands of work which are their favorite kind of style. I think the interesting thing about chaos magic, or one of the interesting things for me, is that it comes down to the organizational sort of structures and the kind of style of work. So in the Illuminates of Thanateros, in the chaos magic network that I'm part of the deal there is that people get to bring ritual practices into the space. So we've been doing lots of work online, of course, recently. So we have online temple meetings where people bring a practice, and it's kind of a bring and share, skill share kind of model. So although you might have people who have an overall responsibility for like managing the Zoom call or managing the space or whatever, the idea is that everyone is empowered to potentially, if they want to, lead a session, lead a practice. People are, of course, welcome to sit those practices out if they don't feel kind of congruent with the style of practice or the aim, the intentions that might be behind that. So I think that what it's really good at, chaos magic, is a kind of an empowerment for people to kind of take control of the magical process for themselves. Like anything, you can kind of parody it and joke about it, and that's cool. It's kind of, in a way, chaos magic has gone way beyond the confines of the IoT, the Illuminates of Thanateros, and it's now just a kind of cultural thing. There's huge groups on Facebook and Discord and various other spaces. And I think the interesting thing about it is that there's a good kind of challenging of assumed positions of hierarchy or exceptional knowledge. There's also a real desire to explore and experiment, and that includes using contemporary cultural references. Like if we talk about, I don't know, Spider-Man, right? You and I both immediately have a picture of how this character looks, what what their special powers are, what their weaknesses are, what their abilities are, and so on. Whereas if I pick something from some ancient, obscure pantheon, I might have to do like a bunch more explanation to talk about, the practice that we're going to do or whatever. So using common cultural reference points is really helpful. We have these imaginal structures in our minds, and chaos magic kind of goes, well, look, let's utilize those. I guess the other two things about it are that there's this emphasis on belief and an emphasis on changing awareness. So you have whatever your ritual is. Let's imagine that I come to a session and I say, I've been doing some work with the runes. I'm going to bring some rune practice. I'm going to bring some Galder singing runes, singing practice, and maybe some Stada standing in the rune postures to do whatever my intention happens to be. So I bring that process to people, and with a skilled group of magicians, they can kind of go into that mind state. Maybe they're familiar with some of the iconography or the way that, say, the Futhark works and the way those processes unfold. So it's about kind of entering a belief envelope, a paradigm, and kind of working within that. And then within that belief envelope, within the paradigm, the question then becomes, well, what's our method of changing awareness? So in that instance, it would be singing, so which changes breath and changes attention. It might be physical movement, standing in the position of the runes. And then when we look at other kind of magical cultures, we can kind of pick them apart a bit. We can deconstruct them and say, okay, so what's the belief envelope? What's the symbols and the signifiers that are used within the system? And what are the ways of changing awareness that are used to fuel the practice? So for me, chaos magic is just it's a historical term, and it's a term that refers to this idea of like stripping back elements in structure in order to understand the way that a magical process might work, the kind of the underlying mechanisms by which it functions, and being very happy to engage in a range of different belief systems, including ones that are drawn from contemporary culture. That's it, basically. And then, of course, there's loads of different styles. You know, you've got the chaos magic of people like Pete Carroll. He's very influenced by like science and mathematics, and that's his kind of shtick. That's what he digs. And then you've got other people who have a much more kind of fluid approach to some of this stuff. So if you take writers, you know, from a little while ago, like Jan Fries, or more contemporary people like Gordon White, they've got their style that they bring to the party. It's a very kind of open environment, I think. And certainly the IoT, certainly the kind of chaos magic crew that I hang out with, what we do is it's like a laboratory. It's like you bring this thing, this practice, you try it out, you see if it works, you look at the logistical effects, people give feedback, and it's a really good way of experimenting and exploring in order to understand, you know, how magic works and how we might use the imagination and changes of awareness to do whatever it is we're up to doing.
So if I'm following you right, you're saying that chaos magicians don't have a core set of beliefs. It's more of like a worldview or an attitude or an approach to figuring out what magic is.
Yeah, I guess in some respects it's like a technique or an approach to something. So, you know, I, in common with probably pretty much everyone on the planet, have things that I consider pretty much true or not true, and my values and beliefs and ethics and so on. But I think there's also an emphasis on the flexibility and fluidity of those things, a recognition of the cultural location of a lot of kind of beliefs and ideas, and a kind of desire to try and sort of step back from whatever's happening and see it in a number of different ways. So, for example, in a ritual, generally speaking, within the ritual kind of environment, let's say we're invoking a deity of some description. Within the ritual environment, we might enter a belief system where we're going to do an invocation to, I don't know, Thoth, yeah, Tahuti, Egyptian god of writing and magic. Fantastic. So we enter that belief system, and in the ritual, we interact with the spirit, with Thoth, through whatever kind of mechanism that's being used. And we kind of go, well, okay, for the purposes of the practice, Thoth is perhaps, in this instance, an external force, perhaps in a different dimension, perhaps it's an archetypal energy, but it's a real thing that we choose to give a face and a persona to. Outside of the ritual, we might think about this in psychological terms. We might think about this in some kind of, you know, if you're Pete Carroll, you might be interested in some kind of quantum stochastic way of understanding what's going on. So you have these different views of the experience, and often that means kind of holding on quite lightly to beliefs. So not trying to remain fluid and flexible as far as is reasonable and possible, because certainly if you think of it in terms of, say, Taoism, that idea of like remaining sort of supple and pliant like a reed, that's kind of where you want to be able to change awareness through a number of different states, from very still point, meditative, quiet, catabolic internal kind of processes, through to being just as comfortable, what one might aspire to be just as comfortable within something like possession states or extreme forms of gnosis, through, dancing, drumming, sex, all those kind of much more anabolic and kind of active styles of trance induction or of altering consciousness. So it's about fluidity, and recognizing, I guess one of the things is that the universe appears to consist of like fixed objects, but in fact, everything is a flow process. And so to try and kind of be like that with our own beliefs and attitudes to the world, the phenomena that we encounter, and often holding quite lightly onto those things. Hence the reason that a classic chaos magic way of banishing, ending your ritual, is to laugh at how crazy it is. Like a bunch of people just put on black robes and started shouting at things that are not apparently visible, in the triangle or whatever they're doing. So you kind of laugh to break set, to go and, let that go into whatever the next phase is going to be. And also to kind of get this humor, which comes through in a lot of the Discordian material within the chaos kind of tradition. You see that in people like Phil Hines' work and various other people. So there's a lightheartedness or a gentleness for me in this, as well as actually for many people a depth of practice. Like I know chaos magicians, gold medal winning martial arts people and other people who are, really fantastic in various scientific fields and so on. So it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be this kind of superficial skirting over the surface, just picking up whatever the next new thing is. But it does mean that you try and aspire to a kind of a flexibility and a fluidity with the kind of way that you approach magic.
What's weird about that to me is, it sounds almost like it's a real individual pursuit at that spot, but there's groups, right? Like you're a part of the IoT. Can you kind of explain, like, what is the IoT and how does that work out with this sort of idea? Like, how does group work play into it when you're dealing with so many different, belief systems?
But I think you can imagine it like, what it actually is it's a peer support network. So you've got like a bunch of individual magicians. They're doing their thing. They're doing their practice. They're part of the IoT network. And if they're part of that network, it means that they can come into this shared space, either virtual or physical, and they can bring a practice and they can share that with other people. The other people have gone through a training program, which ensures that they know like all the kind of fundamental skills of being able to kind of, meditate, focus the mind, be in touch with their own bodies. They're familiar with at least the sort of the basic sort of language of kind of magical culture. So you have a situation where it's rather like if a group of therapists, imagine that you've got this group of therapists, transpersonal therapists, let's say. They do their own therapeutic work, and so they're working with clients, they're doing their own study, they're doing their own personal practice, and then periodically they meet together to share what they've learned. And one person stands up and says, I'm going to do a presentation about some aspect of transpersonal psychology which I've encountered with the people I'm working with, blah, blah, blah. They do their presentation, or they do like maybe it's a workshop where people get to be involved in something. And everyone says, okay, that was great, fantastic. Maybe there's a bit of feedback. And then the next person gets their turn to do like a bring and share from their perspective. And then, of course, people gather together in more kind of coven or lodge style groups. So I've got people who are physically, nearby where I live. And when there's not a pandemic in the air, we gather together and we essentially often will replicate that same model. Sometimes because we're collaborating more closely, we'll be working as 2 or 3 of us, like building a whole ritual structure. So it's not necessarily just the individual who brings that work. It might be a collaboration of several magicians. So I'm part of another kind of online group, which is a part of the IoT, where we've got this international group of magicians all coming together to work on particular kind of projects. And some of those people are working as paired teams or with other kind of relationships in the mix. So it's a good way for individuals to gather together to share group practice. And that's how come, I guess, the system has persisted, or the structure has persisted from the kind of, late 1970s, 1980s, like through to now. It's an international network. There are people all over the place. And, when, like I say, there's not a pandemic, we have various physical meetings, including meetings in, North America, South America, various places in Europe, and then usually a world meeting where as many people who are able to come to that one come together. And of course there is shared community, there's shared like tribal identity, just like you get with any gang of people, and there's shared language, there's terminology that people are familiar with, and everyone knows each other. They're friends. It's a community of, it's a sangha, like the Buddhist idea of a community of practice. That's the deal.
Do you ever bump into, like, it just seems like it would be hard to have everybody meet up at the same time with the same desires and ideas,
Not so much, because, interestingly, you find with groups of magicians, groups of kind of occultists generally, that many people have the same interests, the same concerns, similar things that they want to work on as individuals, and also perhaps acts of magic that they want to do kind of collaboratively in the world. The world is in dire need, perhaps one might suggest, of some good kind of magical activity of one form or another. And so whether or not that finds its way into some kind of meme bombing process, or whether or not that's related to some kind of political, social justice, ecological kind of action, most of these people have kind of politics and ideas where they'll bring a practice, they'll bring a suggestion for what they want to do. And the vast majority of the time, I kind of go, yeah, okay, that sounds good. I'm in for that one. That sounds brilliant. And then people who are working more directly with each other, like a few years ago, me and this guy Steve D, we did a whole 2-year program of working, sort of blending together kind of chaos magic practice and witchcraft. And eventually it turned into a book, Chaos Craft. And the idea of that was to look at the relationship between the 8 colors of magic, a similar kind of thing. We were building these rituals for each of the 8 seasonal celebrations, but also kind of with the vibe of the color of magic that was symbolically associated with each of those festivals. Yeah. And that was a 2-year process that we went through, and there was ritual objects that were manufactured. There was a community of between maybe 8 and 15 people who would gather for each of those festivals. And again, a culture emerges. You get any group of people together for a period of time, a group of friends have got special language they use, signs and signifiers that mean stuff to them. And sometimes those things become global. Somewhere down the line, there's a group of youth who came up with 420, and now it's like a global phenomenon. Do you know what I mean? Right. So, yeah, it's just the way hominids work.
Yeah, right. Speaking of 420, man, you've been getting really into the psychedelic stuff, right, lately? What's is this your most recent book, The Getting Higher?
No, I think embarrassingly there's 2 after that. I think there's
really.
I think there's a book called Walking Backwards.
Embarrassingly for me, my bad.
The art of psychedelic psychogeography, which is just like a slim, sort of art kind of volume that I did with my friend Greg Humphreys. And there's another collection of essays that I did called The Fool and the Mirror that came out, I don't know, man, last year before. Anyway, But Getting Higher was quite a big deal for me, because that was a book that it was a kind of a lot of time brewing up the idea for the book. I knew kind of vaguely what I wanted to produce. I wanted to produce a really accessible way for people to bring the kind of practices that I'd encountered in ritual, both with sort of Western esoteric magical ritual, chaos magic, that kind of thing, and also within North and South American and Indian, Asian kind of magical cultures. And I wanted to bring what I knew to a bunch of people who were buying stuff on the dark web, and this is in my imagination, and say, look, if you've got this stuff, guy, yes, we know all the health and safety, and there's a bit of that in there, but there's a lot of that stuff around. It was more to do with if you have the magic medicine, yes, of course you can just take your psilocybin and watch Rick and Morty. That's a thing. But there may be stuff that you can do that you'll get much more out of the experience. And it doesn't have to be full on ritual with some dude with a hat with feathers in it and stuff, and people using rattles. It's more about helping people recognize that ritualizing behavior has lots of benefits to hold space, to direct things. And it's actually what humans do anyway. When we lose a person that we love, we take plant sex organs and we place them on their grave. And that's what we do as humans.
Mm.
You know, we lay flowers, and we pre-pandemic times, we shake hands. These are all like ritual behaviors, like humans naturally do this stuff. And for many people, if they don't come from a kind of, if they don't have a religious context that allows them to work with psychedelics, and most people don't, then it's a question of saying, okay, so what technologies have we got from different traditions and different styles? What can we learn from contemporary research? And how can we use these things well? So I come to the psychedelic field very much as an occultist. You know, I'm interested in ritual processes and imaginal magical processes primarily. But then I found myself, you know, doing stuff like being a participant in a licensed psilocybin trial in London, working with. So I sit on the board of a peer-reviewed academic journal about psychedelics. And it's, I guess, really, certainly for the last kind of 20 years, it's been something that I've been really, very, very kind of strongly engaged with. Yeah, I've been lucky. I've also had opportunities to go and hang out with various medicine carriers, shaman, for want of better terms, you know, and learn from those dudes. So as far as I'm able to respectfully represent their work and give them respect and all of that kind of stuff, the idea of getting higher was just to present these ideas in a really accessible, like relatively short format, so that people who had the medicine but didn't necessarily have a lineage like me, you know, I don't have a, you know, like I'm a white working class dude, grew up like near London, whatever, didn't have, you know, an ancient wizened shaman to show me how to do these things. So I've had to learn from other people and just pick the things that I found helpful and brew those together in this cauldron and serve it up in the form of a book. There we go. You know, hopefully this is helpful.
Well, I also feel like, and this may be different now, I think times are changing, but in the past, mixing drugs with magic was frowned upon heavily. I mean, you know me, I'm a huge pothead and I love eating mushrooms and stuff. And I've always had people frown about that. And especially when I say that I mix it with magic, and they don't like that. It makes people really uncomfortable. So I thought it's really interesting to see you take the complete opposite stance on that, it seems.
I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think that they're really wrong. I think they're really wrong for historical reasons as well as anything else, because there are lots and lots and lots of examples in the esoteric tradition of the use of psychoactives in one form or another. There's Eliphas Levi doing his famous invocations to visible appearance with Lytton. Now, the dude describes the ritual. What he doesn't describe in any detail in some of the write-ups that he produced was what goes in the incense. Yeah, what's in that incense? If you look at the history of Magick, you see that what's in the incense, or what's in the special draft of wine that you take before you go to the ceremony, there will be psychoactives. Yeah, often they'll be part of the things like the Solanaceae family, so the solanaceous plants, you know, datura, henbane, like dodgy stuff. Cannabis, right, massively used. And if people don't think that the magical tradition has any links with cannabis, what they need to do is they need to buy a copy of a thing called Liber 420 by Chris Bennett, and they need to educate themselves, because it's absolutely part of the lineage. For individual people, whether they choose to use it or not, that's cool. Of course. It's not a necessity, but is it part historically of the Western magical tradition? Yes, it is. Demonstrably, historically, it's part of that story. A lot of the anti-drug thing happens in various waves. So it happens with the work of, say, Dion Fortune. If you read Dion Fortune, she basically says drugs are bad, in a sort of South Park voice in my head, but that's what she says.
Yes. Yeah.
And you find that, you know, now the order that she founded, the Servants of the Light, if you go to their webpage, it says, you know, don't use drugs when you take magic, when you do magic, rather. So I understand that position, but the position is really historically contingent. It's contingent on a group of people doing something that was pretty weird anyway, like dressing up in funny robes and calling on strange spirits in the 20th century, trying to distance themselves from some styles of magic which did take drugs, notably, of course, the bad boy Aleister Crowley. But if you look at the Golden Dawn used mescaline, the Golden Dawn used cannabis, the Golden Dawn used many, many substances that change awareness. The very first trip report that we have arguably is the one by Havelock Ellis in 1898, I think it was published. So Havelock Ellis, sexologist, physician, sort of free thinker type dude. He took mescaline in London and he wrote a report called Mescal, A New Artificial Paradise. Now, in the report, he talks about a friend of his who I think he identifies him as an artist who he gave mescaline to, who found it interesting but didn't really get on with it. Now, the person he's talking about is W.B. Yeats, right, who's in the Golden Dawn. Okay, so you've got like people like W.B. Yeats, and you've got characters like E. Nesbit, famous of children's novels, you know, the things like the Phoenix and the Carpet, this kind of stuff. All these people are knocking around and they're using cannabis in their rituals. They're going into highly painted Technicolor, what we would call psychedelic temples, designed by the amazing set designers in the Golden Dawn, people like Pamela Coleman Smith, who goes on to produce the Coleman Smith Waite deck, the iconic tarot, from which basically most of them are derived. So they have these amazing rooms full of this psychedelic artwork, and they go in there and they do their ritual, and a significant number of them are stoned. That's a fact. That's just a fact, right? You can value magic. You can say, well, that's a bad thing or that's a good thing, but it's just a fact. Yeah, Aleister Crowley, when he did his Rites of Eleusis in 1910, almost certainly dosed the audience with mescaline. Now that's
wow.
That's debatable as to whether or not that's a good move, but Crowley arguably did the first ever be-in. Yeah, so the first ever artwork that was designed, public artwork that was designed to be seen while you were high, way before like the Grateful Dead and Hawkwind and Ginsberg and all these people. So Crowley is doing this work, and okay, he's the bad boy, but the lovely poet W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats, on mescaline, yes, absolutely, it's just the way it is. I mean, he was a great fan of cannabis. Like I said, he didn't find mescaline to his taste, but certainly for over that period of time, the early part of the 20th century, there's a distancing by some of the kind of ceremonial magic crew away from Thelema, away from Crowley, away from, all that dodgy stuff, because people want to be respected and they want to be thought of as like good people, and good people, at least in that context, don't take drugs. Okay, so then we wind on to the latter part of the 20th century, post-World War II, you get the rise of Neo-Paganism, and Neo-Paganism, again, broadly speaking, at least in Britain, it isn't kind of closely connected with drugs. That stuff starts to happen later on, particularly through American culture with things like Castaneda and shamanism and the re-emergence of those ideas. But the idea that drugs and magic don't go together is a little blip in 20th century history. And for the vast majority of the time, they do. They absolutely do.
That's really interesting, man. I've definitely I've been writing as a cannabis reporter for the past 4 years now, full time, and one thing that I've bumped into a lot is how especially indigenous cultures. I was writing in New Mexico, and so I was meeting a lot of indigenous people, and everybody treats cannabis as a sacrament, which, I mean, I guess I don't because I'm just smoking it all day long, but but I thought that was really interesting, that it wasn't, it's not a throwaway drug to a lot of cultures. That's weird.
I mean, it's absolutely the case. And the other thing about cannabis is people sometimes say, oh, cannabis isn't psychedelic, to which my response is always, well, you've not taken enough then, frankly. Because if you eat cannabis or you take it in alcohol, that is Crowley's first experience of samadhi. He links to the use of cannabis. So, and we know that cannabis in particular has got like really deep connections with many kind of different belief systems, particularly as witnessed through Hinduism. or what we call Hinduism, that kind of cluster of ideas in the Asian subcontinent. And I guess also it depends on how we think about taking something as a sacrament. So speaking to you as an indigenous person from the Americas, because I guess you were born there. I don't know how it works,
Yeah.
but the way that I've observed, quote, indigenous people who have got a good relationship with these medicines, is that it isn't necessarily about like only taking it under certain conditions and in a very prescribed kind of way. If you look at the way the Huicholi people use peyote, it's used like really frequently. It's used like as a topical medicine on skin. It's these ceremonies which, from an outside observer point of view, just look like massive festivals. People light fires and they eat the stuff, and then they go dancing, and they go and have some beers, and then they smoke some cigarettes, and they come back to the fire and they sing another song. And I think the thing there is that we're used to being in a kind of this post-Protestant culture thing where you have, here's magic, here's religion. It's the bit you do over here. It's basically a bit boring and a bit worthy. And you have to spend a lot of time like being all, very sort of austere about it. Whereas in other cultures, you might have the same respect might be accorded to this miraculous medicine in, say, Rastafarian culture, where the herb is seen as being like this really important thing. And part of the really important thing about it is the social use of it. Is the way that it bonds and brings people together, and it allows people to kind of go into these altered states communally. So I think that there's a balance to be struck between showing reverence for the medicine and also using the medicine in a way that kind of feels right and appreciating it. That's, I guess, part of it. Yes, we can have some cannabis and carry on with what we're doing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we can also take some cannabis and we can go outside and we can smoke, and we can send some of the smoke up to the sky, down to the earth, whatever. It doesn't have to even be like a big deal. It doesn't have to be like a big ceremony, but it's just about appreciating this medicine, what it does for us, bringing our attention there and doing that with authenticity and a good heart. And that's what matters. It doesn't have to be like the only ritual way of using cannabis would be to not have any cannabis for 3 months and then do some special purification process and then some sort of elaborate ritual, and then finally you get to smoke a joint. I mean, that it's kind of a bit like some of those approaches to tantra where it's just like just making the foreplay like really long and really elaborate. It's like that's cool some of the time, but like part of the thing for me and part of the thing behind kind of getting higher was to say ritualization and appreciation of altering awareness and the substances that can let us do that. We can make that part of our lives. It doesn't have to be something that's just like there's like 6 days in the week and then there's the religious day. It's like to try and blend or break down this boundary between the so-called sacred and the secular. And I observed that a lot when I have hung out with like people from other cultural backgrounds than my own. Like sometimes the ritual looks really kind of informal and it looks really easy. And sometimes the ritual will sort of just unfold in a very kind of everyday sort of sense. I remember being in India and watching the women in the place in South India where I was staying. Like every morning they'd get up and they'd sweep the house, and then the kind of last thing they do is they take some chalk and they'd mark a symbol to bring good luck into the house on the doorstep, right? So where does the ritual begin? Does the ritual begin with the sweeping? Yeah, of course the ritual begins with the sweeping. That's the point. Like the drawing of the chalk thing is just an element of a daily practice called cleaning your house and bringing your attention to the idea that then you invite good stuff in. So it's not like it's total boundary between these different zones. There's magic and there's daily life and there's the things that are important and the things that are just also rands in perception. It's much more kind of whole. And for me, I think that's the way to go with these things.
Man, that's really interesting. Look, that's all cool and good, but I need to circle back to you being a guinea pig for psilocybin. What happened?
So was it beginning of last year, I think it was. Yeah, that's right. So King's College Hospital, which is in the middle of London, basically, they have been running and are continuing to run trials looking at the prospect of using psilocybin to help people who have treatment-resistant depression. So I was part of the first wave of that trial as someone who doesn't have treatment-resistant depression, so that they could just kind of check out how this medicine worked. And they were particularly, I mean, obviously loads of other background work has been done, but they got to the point at that stage where they wanted to find out, would it be possible to run a psilocybin session, and what kind of effects would they get from that? They wanted to kind of like measure people's openness, people's cognitive flexibility, back to the chaos magic thing. How open are you to the prospect of change? If you're depressed, one of the things that's very hard to do is to imagine how it could be better. So they did lots of kind of cognitive measures on us. And they also wanted to find out, would it be possible to run a psilocybin session with 6 people in the room at the same time, each of them in a bed, in a hospital ward. And they did the session brilliantly. Like, they changed the ward around, right, massively. So like they put soft rugs on the floor, took the light level right down, those kind of little pretend LED candle things, and vaporized smell in the space. Each one of us we each had an individual sitter who we'd met the day before. We'd established things like if you're worried, is it okay if I put my hand on top of your hand or on your arm? Is that cool? Yes, that's fine. So we'd established the rapport, and we'd gone through this process, checking all the usual stuff, blood pressure. I remember doing a questionnaire before the session, which was what's called a schizoid personality type questionnaire. It's an incredibly old and really badly worded thing. So I remember the doctor saying to me, as one of the questions, he said, do you ever believe that you're in contact with beings that other people cannot see? and I said, look, in the context of this interview, no, I do not. And he kind of laughed, and it was like, yeah, okay, we have to go through this. Even just this document was hilarious. So there's a lot of kind of changes that have to happen for this process to work in mainstream medicine, but they're happening. So essentially, there were 6 of us, some of whom had psilocybin and other psychedelics before. One of whom I know had never had anything. They'd never taken cannabis or any other like significant psychoactive beyond probably alcohol. And there we are in this room, low light levels. It's all lovely. It's about 10 a.m. in the morning. We're given a little paper cup with a series of small pills in it. And the pills could contain one of 3 things. They could either be placebo, so sugar pills, or they could be 10 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin, or they could be 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And it's a double-blind test, yeah? So no one knows what they're going to get.
And how much is that, like, in like street level? Like, what are we talking?
Conversion. All right. So 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin is.
Well, how high does that get you, I guess, is the question.
So it's a moderately high dose. If it was cubensis mushrooms, I would say that it is between 3.5 and 4 grams. And if it was Liberty caps, I would say, Semilanceata, the ones that grow in Britain, that's maybe like 50 mushrooms, something like this. So like significant, but not like the walls are melting. I don't know who I am.
Not a heroic dose, but pretty close.
Yeah. Just like moderately strong. In fact, the dude who was managing the session, who was brilliant, he said, we call this the active dose. So they don't use like moderately strong. They just say it's the active dose. And it is pretty much the sweet spot. If you want to do like psychotherapy, like psychedelic psychotherapy, it's kind of nice because you're really in it, but you can take yourself to the bathroom if you need to. I mean, the sitter kind of comes with you as far as the door just to check that you're all good. And I was very fortunate because I got, as far as I'm aware, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, because I could have had like a really, I imagined I would do some writing, get some rest if I got the placebo, but I would have been disappointed. Fortunately, I didn't get the placebo. So I had to make the experience of like lying there in this hospital bed I brought a few objects. In fact, I brought a magical object. I brought a spirit that me and a bunch of other chaos magicians have been working with, which is a physical sculpture, which is a character called Izawa, who's a spirit we made to help the liberation of the psychedelic gnosis for the benefit of all beings. So Izawa is like there in the corner by my bed, this kind of weird gold mirrored sculpture thing with horns and stuff. I had like a favorite like poncho that I had with me, and off we go. So put on the eye shades, put on the headphones, little bit of light classical music, and then I start to think, this is okay. So this is good. This is something. There's something here. And within like another 5 minutes, it's like, yes, I've lucked out. This is like the proper dose. This is the active dose. And then I spent the usual thing, 3-4 hours, mostly lying down, just going into the vision, going through my own experience. I remember at one stage going to the bathroom, and the dude who was sitting for me, a really nice guy, we sort of walked down to the bathroom along a corridor, which is all lit with these tiny little tea lights. And I could just see beyond the door. I could see out into the car park. So it's like police cars and like ambulances and like people, central London, like running around, doing all that. And so, went to the bathroom, did my stuff, gazed at myself briefly in the mirror, came out. And I said to the guy who's sitting for me, I said, it's about 3 a.m. in this club. And he laughed. Like he knew, like, these are people, yeah? And these are people working in psychedelic therapy. Like I couldn't fault it. Like, bless them. They came to me afterwards and they said, like, what we have done better. And I was going, like, nothing. There's nothing you could have done better. It was a brilliantly held session. I remember going back into the room. And as I came back into the room, there's all these beds with people like sitting really kind of quiet, the sitters, and the people in the beds like doing their thing. Some of whom are clearly bored because they've got the placebo. Some of whom are clearly not because they got something else. And I just found myself, as I came back in, I just found myself like putting my hands together and bowing, because it was a ceremony. Yeah, it was a ceremony, and the people running the show, without getting too much into the details, they knew the score, as we say over here. Yeah, they knew the territory. They were very, very, very good. Very good. And so the trajectory for the work is that within a few years, like a handful of years, we should have psilocybin therapy to help people with treatment-resistant depression available on the National Health Service, which basically means it's free at the point of provision.
Wow.
So you've gone through CBT and you've gone through MBSR and you've gone through all these acronyms of therapy, and you've had some, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It hasn't worked. Okay, so we bring out the big guns in the form of the little mushroom, and that's what we do. And so the protocol will probably be something like my friend Ben Sessa has been working a lot with MDMA, with people with alcoholism. So the protocol is established now. It's like you have several sessions, you get to know the people, you build the rapport, you figure out what the issues are. You go through the session, and like in the session, the people don't instruct you to do anything. They don't sort of, if you're there having a blissful time, they won't come, pull the eye shades back and say, think about your depression. Think about how are you going to get put through this? It's like, no, let it do its work. Let the person do their work. And then afterwards, you've got all the integration, talking about it, figuring out, the main thing. And this is a kind of a theory that I've got about psychedelic therapy, which is that the main thing is that people come out with like a new metaphor. They come out with a new language to talk about, like, I don't know, what horrible abuse thing has happened to them, or their depression or their trauma. And so what they find is that they have a new way of speaking about whatever the thing was, and a new way of kind of sitting with, a new way of coming to like an accommodation with whatever the problem has been. And that discovery of the new metaphor, or however it works, the discovery of healing is, it's incredibly good. It's incredibly reliable. It's like way beyond any of the other interventions that we have in medicine. It's, and that's not to say that, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those kind of antidepressants, they're not useful for some people some of the time, because they clearly are. but they're massively overprescribed. They're maintenance rather than cure. And if you look at the figures for things like MDMA psychotherapy in the US, with MAPS are doing, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, they've got now longitudinal data, so data from people who've gone through the program like 4 years ago, and 67%, if I remember the figure correctly, which I'm pretty sure I do, 67% of people 4 years later who've come into an MDMA psychedelic therapy program with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So again, they've tried everything. 67% of those people 4 years later don't meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at all, right? At all.
Wow.
It's a no-brainer, you know.
Very impressive.
Like it's an incredibly successful way of dealing with addictions, trauma, dealing with creative blocks. There's been some really interesting research a few years back in Britain looking at, could you use LSD to help people problem solve, and problem solving with like engineers, mathematicians, scientists? And the short answer is yes, you can. Like we know from anecdotal evidence, this is the case. The RNA polymerase reaction, the reaction that's used, amongst other things, to create, as part of the testing for viruses, the RNA polymerase reaction was discovered by a dude who claims to have got his insights from acid. So, and that's just like the anecdotal stuff. And now we're getting this big wave of clinical data from now in the early 21st century. And all of it points towards the fact that for many people, not everyone, but for many people, these medicines curated in the right space, so held in what I would describe as the right kind of ritual container, can help heal people. What's not to like about this? I mean, Nixon's war on drugs was just about a war on the Black Power movement, the Vietnam War, anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't anything to do with the danger of the drugs. The substances themselves, we know, tremendously safe, safer than caffeine, safer than alcohol, safer than tobacco by a long way. So the fact that to that stage is just brilliant.
Psilocybin in particular, I know, with the new metaphor that you're talking about, it's something about the neural pathways being reset, which is revolutionary, really. That's not something that anything else can do, and it's still not totally understood. But I think that's kind of why these doors are opening now, and we're starting to see more research being allowed for, especially psilocybin in particular. It's interesting how quickly the narrative on that has switched.
There have been people sort of working away in the background, trying to keep the the flame of this sort of research alive over the years, which has been great in various places over the world, across the world. But the contemporary material that's coming out is like there's a really strong, absolutely solid scientific case for bringing these medicines into wider use. And allowing clinicians to use them. I mean, the hilarious thing is that you can walk out on the street, go and buy MDMA, but if you're a clinician like Ben Sessa, a doctor, you can't give this even in a kind of, because it's a class A Schedule 1 substance, and there's like a whole raft of stuff behind that up until relatively recently.
I was about to say, it seems like that's definitely turned around like completely within the last year, just in the last year alone. Even here in the States, it's the same way. The doors are just completely flying open. I think they've started doing trials with veterans, which is, wild. That's completely wild. Speaking of that, speaking of the legality of it, can we? I kind of wanted to talk about your friend Leonard Pickard. Is that how you say his name, or Pickard? Like the captain, yeah. Yeah, can you tell me his story? What happened? That's good news, right?
It is good news. So, Leonard is a fascinating guy. I've only got to know him since he was in prison. So he's recently, a matter of a few days back, been released from a maximum security federal prison in the Arizona desert. And his crime was that allegedly he was involved in a ring producing LSD. He was busted in, I think it was like 1999, thereabouts, with a thing called the Kansas Missile Silo Bust, which, you can read about all over the internet. This is a man who had, he was not involved in any kind of like violent crime, and whatever we might think about LSD manufacture, he certainly wasn't doing it for the money, because he was already had like a professional position. He was doing it rightly or wrongly because he believed that this medicine, that the LSD, is a powerful agent for social and cultural change, right? He was then sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, right? So this dude who's like he was like 54, mid 50s, something like this, has just got out 20 years later. It's very much, it reminds me of another earlier case of a guy called Timothy Tyler, who was a deadhead who was imprisoned for dealing acid. And he was put away again for, I think, a comparable kind of period of time under the 3 strikes and you're out law that existed, and also served a huge prison sentence for LSD. And he wasn't even like making the stuff. But going back to Leonard, I kind of got in touch with him because he wrote a book published in 2016 called The Rose of Paracelsus, which is a fantastic and fascinating book. It's like this massive, fat 700-page long story about 6 underground high-level LSD chemists who produce planetary scale batches of LSD because they believe that this will help transform society for the better. And they kind of have these sort of superpowers because they've been exposed to, like, it's kind of classic, comic book stuff. If they having been exposed to vast quantities of LSD, now they have these superpowers, and they do. And the book is like really poetic and really beautifully written. And I've been involved with a project with various people to create an audio version of the book. So there have been several of us reading chapters from the book. There's a lot of stuff online with the psychedelic salon. So Lorenzo's psychedelic salon. It's on SoundCloud and various other places. But the book is amazing. The book is really, really fascinating. And it was written on paper, in pencil, in a room, like a matter of a few feet by a few feet, a steel room in the middle of the desert. And it's amazing, partly because it's like Leonard trying to remember the world. Like it goes in, it's all in these different locations, different bits of like New England and California and India and the Middle East. And it's kind of elements from his story. So there's elements that are autobiographical and elements that are, let's call it, more creative. I mean, I don't know how autobiographical all of it is. But we started speaking via email and occasional phone calls a few years back. So yeah, I just kind of got involved with that work, and also with various magicians and practitioners of various descriptions, setting intentions that perhaps we could change the way psychedelics are understood, and that people like Leonard could be liberated from prison. I mean, I don't know quite how it is in the States now, but it was the case that there were still people serving life imprisonment in the US for pot-related crime.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, okay, so there's the whole pot lifers thing, and there's the Can Do Foundation about clemency. Like, let's take this back a bit. So you're telling me that in a culture that's increasingly decriminalizing cannabis, there are still people, and there are some heart-rending stories, people who've found themselves at the sharp end of the conspiracy legislation in the US, which also seems to be completely crazed as far as I can tell. Like, you can get off the charges if you can basically rat on somebody else, and then eventually it gets to the person who can't rat on anyone else, and they serve like the full term. It's like, how barbaric, how utterly barbaric is that? So the liberation of psychedelic prisoners, the liberation of prisoners of the drug war, particularly those kind of like non-violent offenders, for me, that's something that however you're involved in it, whether it's just like writing to an individual person to just like tell them what's going on in the outside world, give them a bit of support, whether it's writing to your congressman or whoever, whatever mechanism you've got available, like, we've got to do this as well, the war on drugs has been brutal, pointless, massively expensive, and caused huge amounts of human suffering. And as culture changes, and frankly, culture is changing partly because like all the old dudes are dying. You know, all the people who can totally absorb that, like Nixon, you smoke, you know, you inject one marijuana and you'll go crazed, and you know, and that's how it will be. Like all that
years
is slowly being attenuated, dropping out of culture. And so as we find ourselves in this different story with people using psychedelics, talking about them, talking about therapy, yeah, I just am mindful of the fact that there are legal issues and there are people still very much behind bars over this. So seeing Leonard released, particularly because this guy was the one who first alerted the US government to fentanyl. He's one of the first people, because what he was doing, to alert formally, to go to, you know, whoever it was in the administration, and the DEA or whoever it would have been, and say, there's this thing going to happen. And some of this is kind of in the book where, okay, so the Soviet Union breaks down, that changes. There's a whole bunch of chemists. What are they going to make? They're going to make these new opiates because they're relatively easy to produce. They're very, very strong. So you don't have to physically make much of the material to make a good dollar. Leonard warned the government about this and continued to do so while he was in jail, right? So, like, give the man a break. He's done 2 decades in the desert without having seen a tree. You know, like, really. And he's not alone. I mean, there are other people like Timothy Tyler who've been released, but there are many others who should be.
Well, how did he get released? What happened? Do you know?
Yeah. So he put in an application under, I think there was a change of law in the US. I think it was in 2018, the First Steps Act, I think it's called, which was looking.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So it's, as I understand it, it's about people who've like served substantial sentences for non-violent drug-related crime. I think, kind of, although the judgment, which I read the submissions and I read the judgment and so on. It doesn't mention COVID-19, but I think that there's also an element of like, this dude's 74, he's living in a box in the desert. Like, let's get him out because it's not good. It's a risk for a variety of reasons. And also, I think because there have been lots of people who'd supported him. So Ben Sessa, who I mentioned earlier on, doing the MDMA psychotherapy, wrote a beautiful letter in support of Leonard's quote early release. Julie Holland, who works with MAPS, also wrote some stuff. So a whole bunch of people like came together to put this pressure on, and fortunately, the magical spirit of Izawa be praised. They let him go. They put him on a bus and sent him home.
That's such amazing news, man. That's so crazy. But honestly, like I was actually going to point that specific law out because that was that was White House backed, that legislation, which is, it's amazing. I was recently watching a clip from, what is the group called? Oh, Evangelicals for Trump. And there's, I don't know if you know about this, but there is an official, like, spiritual, I guess, like, advisor in the White House. And it's this lady who's like, I don't know, she's crazy, but she's speaking to this group of evangelicals, and it's a rally for Trump, and she starts talking about Biden and how he's been locking people up for drugs for years, over drugs, just drugs, over marijuana. Could you believe it? And everybody's cheering and clapping, and I was like, what the fuck kind of weird world am I in now, where the evangelicals have switched sides and are now criticizing the drug war? It's over. You know what I'm saying? That stuff is over. We're just kind of waiting for it to pan out.
And that's, I think, where you get into going back to almost the chaos magic thing. It's like what we consider to be the lines that are drawn in the sand are in sand and can be erased and moved, So I can imagine, is this the same lady who's kind of advising on whether or not you have sex with demons or something? Is that the same person in the
Sounds like it.
Could well be. Anyway, you have that thing where you kind of rock up and say, look, it says in Genesis that, you've got all these seed bearing, blah, blah, blah. And you go, oh, well, fantastic. It's about like presenting information in the way that makes sense from the point of view of that belief system. And of course, you can then, once you've done that, you can start to kind of modify things and bring things in other directions, and maybe even introduce ideas that might be considered more liberal, but are framed in a way that's intelligible to that community. So when MAPS started working with MDMA psychotherapy, they decided that they would work with the military. So they could have worked with firefighters. I mean, they have subsequently. They could have worked with firefighters. They could have worked with like medics, people who support those who've been through rape crisis experiences. But what they chose was the military, because their reasoning was, and Rick Doblin's pretty clear about this. He said, look, in America, it's a massively militarized country. There's this whole patriot thing. If we can work with the military, and there's a lovely document, I think, where he says something like, the military have got the most guns, that's why we should work with them, and you can see it, like, even from a genuinely Buddhist compassionate point of view, this is where the most trauma is, where war is waged. If you can work in that setting, then yeah, you can work back to depressed IT workers, that's fine. But if you start with the depressed IT workers, it's not going to work in the cultural setting in which we find ourselves in the United States. Yeah. So you go into the heart of the beast and you work there. It's like the shadow work. It's all, you go to where the darkness is, where the treasure lies. That's where you need to head. That's where you need to head. You need to head into this stuff and then find ways of like making that transformation possible. So we get to a situation where the evangelicals, the Trump, are going, this drug war is crazy. It's like, yeah. It is. I agree. You're totally right. There's many other things that we may have disagreements about, but this particular issue, amen.
You're right. It's just, man, the world's weird. Julian, I think I've got you on here long enough. I'm about to turn into a pumpkin. What have you been working on recently? You've got the blog of Baphomet is still going, right? Still running strong.
Yeah, yeah.
And now you've got this YouTube show called My Magical Thing. I've been watching that. That's a really fun one. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. So my professional work is I work in museums and galleries, and I do what they call engagement work. So I kind of work to help people be curious about all the objects and art that's in these collections and how they might kind of connect with it. Because otherwise it's just like a bunch of boring old stuff in a box. Yeah. And so I'm very interested in objects. I'm very interested in like the way an object is the anchor for a story. So when the lockdown kind of came, I was thinking, I quite fancy like some crazed side project. What can I do? And I thought, well, I'll basically Skype my friends and people that I would like to speak with, and I'd ask them to show me a magical thing that they've got, and to tell me the story of it. And again, it's that process of if you ask someone directly, so can you tell me about your practice? And you go, oh, well, I do yoga and Tai Chi and meditate. And then every 6 weeks I do a ceremonial blah, blah, blah. Very boring. But if you say, so that magical thing you've got on the wall back there, tell me about that one. And that reveals a lot more and you get a lot more out of it, particularly in like, 6-10 minutes, whatever. So hopefully it's, fun and frivolous and entertaining, but man, there's some deep stuff in there, like Lon Milo DuQuette's story about his wand, which I'd read previously. I was so pleased that he told the story on camera. There's so much teaching in that. Or like Lionel Snell's drum, or Caroline Tully's like a tree goddess figurine that she's got. Like there's loads of really nice stuff that's kind of revealed from that process. And so I'm going to keep that one going for a little while. And at the moment I'm designing a psychedelic journey work course specifically for psilocybin with these dudes called the Fungi Academy, who are based in Guatemala. So somewhat amusingly, they've come to the quotes shaman from the home counties in England, all the way from Guatemala, got in touch and kind of went, can you do this thing? It's like, yeah, I'm very happy to help. So I've been filming a whole series of kind of lessons for that, writing a bunch of materials for that. Yeah, and then just carrying on with the online work, looking forward eventually to get to a situation where I can meet together with all my friends and we can just hang out and do some magic and do some shrooms in person. That's me.
Nice. Yeah. What about any books? It sounds like I already missed a couple. But are there any new ones on the way?
So, uh, no, I was talking to a friend about this last night and saying that the annoying spirits are starting to tap me on the shoulder about a new thing. So there is something that's when I get past this psychedelic journey work course, then I'm gonna just kind of spend a little bit more time thinking about that. I suspect something else that brings together maybe the strands of magic and psychedelics, but in a slightly different way than Getting High. Getting High was deliberately designed to be, like, I hope, really accessible for people. It's the kind of put it in your back pocket, really easy read. And I'd like to do something that is, I don't know, just kind of goes into the whole field in a bit more depth, maybe addresses some of those questions like, is it cool to use marijuana when you're doing magic? And the answer to which is, yes, it is. And here's a brief historical rundown of why it is, and the various points of contact between the esoteric tradition and the kind of psychedelic culture. So probably something like that, I would imagine. That's going to be the next great plan.
Great, man. So where's the best place for people to find you right now? Is that on the blog at Baphomet site?
Baphomet is probably the easiest one, but I mean,
and that's where you can sign up for all the online stuff. And
yeah. There's a link there to I've got a Teachable site as well, which I'm just starting to populate with material as well. So if you go to the blog of Baphomet and have a look on the left hand side, there's a bunch of links. One of which is links to I think it's just what is it now? Deep-Magick teachable.com, something like this. It's in the early stages of construction, but there's a core magical skills course there, which people have been really enjoying, which is, again, like just lots of video lectures, lots of material. It's a good 3-4 months worth of program, I guess, for people to kind of get into. Looking at like spirit work and banishing rituals, meditational practice, bodywork practice, various things. But yeah, the blog of Baphomet is probably the easiest thing to point people to at the moment. Yeah.
Great, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Julian, you're one of the sweetest people I've ever met, and I always like talking to you. I always love speaking to you. So hopefully you'll come on again, and I can talk your ear off again. Maybe next time Ken will stick around.
Josh, you're really, really welcome. Lovely to speak with you. Cheers, man.